What follows is a critique of what is known as being the first published book about Rastafarianism, titled The Promised Key and written by G. Mara, Leonard Howell, aka the Gong, in 1934. He was a Garveyite and a member of the UNIA who had begun preaching about the importance of King Rastafari, a black man and the Emperor of Ethiopia, over that of the white British monarch of that time, King George V, getting himself into trouble with the colonial authorities in Jamaica. He was arrested and jailed on charges of sedition in the same year, but it is probable that he wrote this book before he was sent to prison. It is an uncompromising piece of work that at first glance might appear to be the ramblings of a madman, but in fact on deeper assessment he can be found to be making some very valid and sound theoretical points, in the face of a stifling and oppressive system that in those days still didn't recognize the right of most black people to have a vote. His focus in the making of this book is undoubtedly the liberation of all black people, body, mind, and soul, allowing them to see the truth and step off that slave train which encourages them to hate themselves and bow down to the stranger. Hopefully the following critique will help the reader to digest the contents of this book, an amazing slice of Jamaican history from a black perspective, with some understanding of the context and environment that it was written in, should anybody decide to get a copy of The Promised Key to read for themselves. It might be considered fair to say, there is some kind of genius rising from out of what they had thought was madness. Check out this critique for yourself. The Promised Key, Critique. The first two paragraphs of the first chapter basically draws attention to the fact that Ethiopia was an African nation that had managed up until that point in history to maintain its independent status, free from the European colonization that had been spreading across the continent like wildfire. This, along with their long Christian heritage, made the culture of that place to be seen as something to be greatly admired as well as emulated where possible. The paragraphs that follow in this chapter are basically a combination of some known facts about the coronation of King Rastafari through media reports, mixed with an interpretation of the royal crowning of a king from amongst God's chosen people as depicted in the Bible, taking aspects from verses in Psalms and Genesis to give a picture of what Gong, the author, had believed to be a reliable report of the occasion, having very little access to any existing film footage or media write-ups, at the time, beyond that which was being severely controlled by the crooked will of the colonial powers of the day. Gong continues his Bible-inspired assault on the colonial powers in this chapter, calling the Pope of Rome the personification of Satan the devil, who was in league with the Anglo-Saxon slave masters of past times whose descendants and beneficiaries must be brought down to the lowest of places, using the unforgiving and punishing words of Isaiah chapter 47 as a reference point. Leaning heavily on the legendary Solomonic heritage of the King of Kings to presume a strong link to Bible prophecy, Gong paints a picture of all the kings of the world laying down their crowns before him, pronouncing King Rastafari to be the supreme God and delivering a short verse of poetry entitled Forward to the King of Kings to emphasize the need for the oppressed black people of the world to turn their eyes towards the Ethiopian emperor. The Gong continues in this chapter referring to King Rastafari and his wife Queen Omega as being the foundation stone, blessings from which when received, the oppressed black people of the world can expect to be redeemed from their present pit of doom. In this short chapter, Gong talks of a need for the souls of the oppressed black people to be rebuilt through a cleansing and healing process to take place on holy ground in a place he calls the barnyard, safe from the raging wolves of society, under the protection of King Alpha, the King of Kings. This chapter is also very brief, in which Gong states that to gain entrance to the barnyard individuals must believe in the power of King Rastafari in addition to paying an admission fee varying from around 4 shillings, about the equivalent of what would be the value of £12 in 2023. In this it can be surmised that his intention was the formation of a new black fraternity or secret society. In this chapter, Gong dismisses the cold music of the church ministries, stating that music should only be made in dedication to the King of Kings. His semi-acceptance of the revivalist culture indicates that the kind of music that he was referring to as his favored beat, was that which used and relied on the sound of the drum, inherited from the African ancestors from a time, in some cases, not so long gone. But he rejects firmly the idea that the barnyard could be used as a free-for-all to use as a public hospital or an opium shop, stressing that it would be no place for the practice of curses and spells, or for the demonic rituals, all of which had been introduced by the deceiving white supremacists and their black agents. His prescribed rituals would lean towards, as was also practiced in ancient African culture, fasting followed by baptism with no regard for the sentimentalities of the white supremacist. It is in this context, very much tainted by the realities of the times, living under the unjust system of white supremacy, that he uses the term black supremacy, recognizing that the ancient African civilization and culture offered to all black people a better and more spiritually secure way of life. In this chapter, Gong describes the ritual concerning the fast which he recommends can be done on a weekly basis. The purpose of fasting, as he explains it, is to essentially overcome the mental slavery and diverse doctrines inflicted upon the black population by the white colonialists and their brainwashed loyal black followers. The fast would then be followed by bathing, a baptism, so that the individual is fully revived and ready to break their fast. In this short chapter, the Gong states that Africa is the capital of the world, being in existence before what he calls the time of the Adamic deadly disease, when there was still just one perfect language. Given his perhaps narrow view of the world, or otherwise his witty sense of humor, he also makes Jamaica to be the capital of the slave traders' world, with the various languages spoken by them being instruments of their stupidity, lies and deception. In this chapter Gong refers to black supremacy, which is the term he uses to describe the ancient African culture and civilization, as being about to take over from the dominant system of white supremacy. Although this system is a benefit to all people of all shades, he is very firm in his belief that there should be no race mixing, which during those days for the black man in particular, was the safest practice to follow. Gong turns his attention to the church ministers in this chapter, stating that they cannot be accepted into the body of the spiritual movement for black liberation because they preach and teach about Adam and Eve, Abraham and Isaac, all who never wrote any of the books in the Bible, which in Gong's calculation meant that all of these personalities were what might be called made-up cartoon characters. As teachers and believers in the stories of Adam and Abraham, the church ministers cannot therefore also be followers of King Alpha and Queen Omega, as it is considered not possible for them to serve two masters. Gong opens this chapter by highlighting the Adamic tree of knowledge as opposed to the tree of life, which are both mentioned in Genesis chapter 2 and are used as a reference point for his statement. The tree of knowledge, as he states, is the tree that the white Eve, the mother of evil, is associated with, whilst the tree of life was under the guardianship of the black King Alpha and Queen Omega, who had returned in the present time, in the view of the Gong, having been present in the earliest Bible times. Anglo-Saxon, a term that the Gong repeats several times throughout the book, was being used by him in a broader context to cover all of the European nations who had been in control of the former slave colonies. Identifying King Alpha and Queen Omega as the ancestors of black people, he states firmly that they are no relations to the white Adam and Eve, who form part of the wider plot to keep the Ethiopian in bondage or to kill them, highlighting a few chapters from the Book of Judges in the Bible. In this chapter, Gong makes some comments about the racist Ku Klux Klan in America and the mob lynching policy that was persisting in that country during those times, which he puts down to their Anglo-Saxon heritage. It is the ancestors of these people that Gong claims were raping the slave women during the days of slavery, resulting in their spiritually criminal instincts and behaviors being passed down the following generations through the slave days to the present times, amongst some members of the black American communities. In this chapter, Gong tackles what he calls the Ethiopian question. Referring to the continent of Ethiopia, Africa, he describes how others had in past times visited and cohabited with her, taking advantage of her sympathy and kindness, before abusing and persecuting her. He goes on to speak of a need for Ethiopian, black, people to build anew, freeing themselves from the exploitative and riotous indoctrinations of the Anglo-Saxon former slave masters, who had previously been allowed to take everything that had at first belonged to the Ethiopian but must now be taken back. Gong uses this chapter to affirm his belief that King Rastafari and his wife Queen Omega are the rulers of the world and the keepers of the Tree of Life, who reject those implanted aspects of the Bible put in place to oppress the black people. Seeing it as being their will, he is therefore, almost prophetically, confident that the black people will be triumphant in Jamaica, the slave traders' capital of the world, adding that the Anglo-Saxon white people who were living there would fade away, or as he puts it, die out. In this short chapter, Gong refers to the union between King Alpha and Queen Omega and the significance in relation to the re-establishment of black supremacy, which is the term he uses to describe the ancient African civilization and culture. The final chapter is a call to all black people to turn their back on the white man's doctrine, which the Gong described as being a trick that takes them away from King Rastafari and forces them to forsake the Tree of Life to seek heaven after death. As the earth's rightful ruler, Gong states that the black people should be seeking to gain knowledge of the Rastafari kingdom, reminding them that the Pope of Rome and his preachers are the greatest opponents of Rastafari.
These are the words of Leonard Howell, the Gong. A quote from his book, The Promised Key, written in 1934. Now, my dear people, let this be our goal. Forward to the King of Kings must be the cry of our social hope. Forward to the King of Kings to purify our social standards and our way of living, and rebuild and inspire our character. Forward to the King of Kings to learn the worth of manhood and womanhood. Forward to the King of Kings to learn his code of laws from the mount, demanding absolute love, purity, honesty, and truthfulness. Forward to the King of Kings to learn his laws and social order, so that virtue will eventually gain the victory over body and soul, and that truth will drive away falsehood and fraud. Members of the King of Kings, arise for God's sake, and put your armor on.